Record. All right. Okay, so we will go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. I am Dr. Jen Kling, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for our monthly Philosophy in the City series, which happens on the first Friday of every month during the academic year. And really the goal of this series is to bring philosophy like out of the ivory tower and into the everyday. Because I know sometimes it's tempting to be like, oh, philosophers, right? They do these crazy abstract things and nobody really knows what it is that we do. But in point of fact, right, philosophy deals with lots of things that come up in the everyday, right? It's really deeply engaged with the world and has a lot to say about the things we do in our everyday lives. So one of the premises, I guess, of philosophy in the city is that everybody does philosophy. Sometimes we just don't talk about it in that way. And so philosophy in the city is really sort of designed to draw that out. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We are sponsored by UCCS, and in particular UCCS Downtown. So thank you, I will say. Even though we're virtual right now, when we're in person, that's where we are. So thank you very much. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Our focus for tonight is Nerd Wars, a philosophical conversation about fans and fandoms, which is really exciting. So we have gathered tonight an internationally renowned, I feel comfortable saying that, an internationally renowned group of philosophers who think hard about fans and fandoms and all the questions that surround this piece of our culture. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and maybe say a little bit about their fandoms, and then we'll go from there. So just so you know in the audience what's going to happen is I have some questions that I'll be asking our panelists, and then I will encourage questions from the audience. Audience, if you ever have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat, and I will ask it, and we will go from there. That sounds like a plan. All right. So let's see. Just because this is the order that it's happening in my screen, Court, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Cortland Lewis. I go by Court usually, but I've been a Doctor Who, I've been a Star Trek nerd, I've even been a Star Wars nerd, all sorts of stuff. So my most recent book is, well, The Real Meaning of Doctor Who. And then last year I came out with kind of a memoir, Who Cares? My Life with Tom Baker. Tom Baker's a doctor, if you don't know. And also I have, I branch into music. I do a lot of music. So I did Kiss in Philosophy. I edited that a year or so ago. And so that's fairly new. And as I'm sure Paula will talk about, we did some books together. So anyway, I'm a big Doctor Who nerd. I teach at Pellissippi State Community College in Knoxville, Tennessee. And this is my son playing with one of his many TARDISes. And so just thankful for Jen and the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs for inviting me here.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Welcome, Court. All right, so next just in my list on my screen is Paula.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paula Smithka. I am Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Southern Mississippi. I'm also a program coordinator for the Philosophy and Religion program in the School of Humanities here. Actually, thanks to Court, he turned me on to Doctor Who, and ever since I've been a complete addict of Doctor Who, and there are just so many really cool aspects in philosophy that get presented in Doctor Who that hopefully we'll get to talk about some of those tonight. So as Court already put up, he and I co-edited Doctor Who in Philosophy and more Doctor Who in Philosophy. most recently, I've just done an article called "The Doctor is Philosopher: The Collectivist Realist Pacifism of the Doctor." So that's coming out in the Palgrave Handbook of Popular Culture as Philosophy. So I look forward to this evening and chatting with all of you. And Jen, thanks so much for inviting me, and University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, man. I'm super excited for this handbook. I think that handbook would be really helpful for the class that I'm teaching. I see some of my students, hi students, on pop culture and philosophy. All right, so next on my screen is Jose. You want to go for it?
Hi there, my name is Dr. Jose Antonio Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon. And I want to thank Jen for the invitation here and for hosting us through the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. I've been long an admirer of my co-panelists and their work in pop culture for many, many years. I am a dyed-in-the-wool Star Trek fan. And I'm here from the bridge of the USS Cerritos from the animated series Lower Deck. This is my Cerritos uniform. I do own about, I would have to say about 20 different uniforms. And in fact, here's my claim to fame. I was married in the Deep Space Nine uniform. So my wife allowed me to wear a Star Trek uniform to get married. I'm new to thinking about philosophy and Star Trek. I've been teaching a class on the ethics and social political philosophy of Star Trek for about 4 or 5 years now. And it inspired me to produce a book, which is coming out in just a few weeks, called Star Trek's Philosophy of Peace and Justice. And I'm very excited to see what people think about what I think are some really significant ideas in one of the oldest of the big pop culture franchises, which is Star Trek. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion tonight and our sort of comparative discussions about what we can get philosophically from all of these different fandoms.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, if that's not love, I don't know what love is. So that's amazing. Awesome. All right. And last but certainly not least, Colin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Dr. Colin Lewis. Like Jen, I'm also based at UCCS, where I'm an instructor in the philosophy department. I appreciate many fandoms in the fantasy sci-fi genres, superhero genres. But tonight, I mean, I'm mostly repping my beloved Star Wars, which for me, I think really was the property that got me into fantasy sci-fi as a genre and as a fandom to begin with. And it's stuck with me through the good and the bad. It's all Star Wars, and I really, really enjoy it. I appreciate it. And unlike my other illustrious colleagues here, I haven't actually published anything on my fandoms. But maybe that'll change. That I'm actually teaching, co-teaching with Jen, actually, a course on philosophy and pop culture, where we started off talking about how Star Wars has created a kind of monoculture that everyone can take part in, which is really cool.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So, and I'm Jen, as I said, and I will just say I'm a casual fan of a lot of things. But I know nobody likes a casual fan. So, you know, but I am what I am, and I'm kind of proud of it, right? I know a little bit about a lot. But I actually think that leads into the first question for our panelists. And again, audience, welcome. And if you have any questions, feel free, I can't say that phrase. Please throw them in the chat, and I will be sure to ask them of our panelists. Panelists, just to get us started, can you say a little bit about what does it mean to be a fan? What does it mean to be a fan of something, right? Like, what does that mean? What does it take to be a fan? I have been told I am not a real fan because I don't cosplay or go to conventions often. But so does anybody want to?
Yeah, I'll hop in, and I'll keep it short because I know everyone else wants to. So fan is short for fanatic. And so to be a fan on one level is to be insane and crazy and own a bunch of costumes, which I'm right there with you, Jose. I've got several Star Trek costumes and Doctor Who costumes, and so I understand. But it also means I think casual fans can be fanatics too in their own little way, right? I mean, loving different things is not bad. And so that's where, I think about the movie Fanboys, which I don't know if y'all have seen that. It's a very Star Wars, Star Trek kind of versus Star Trek kind of movie, which is quite hilarious. But when I go to conventions, whether they're just Doctor Who conventions or general sci-fi conventions, what's really neat about fans is that they just enjoy what they enjoy. And whether it's Futurama or Doctor Who, Star Trek, Star Wars, just whatever, right? As long as you're having fun and participating in that kind of atmosphere, then that makes you a fan. And so I mean, I do know there are some people who would say you're not a real fan if you don't do XYZ. And to me, I'm like, hogwash, right? A fan is just somebody who enjoys what they're doing. So
Thank you. Does anybody else want to jump in? We have our first question from the audience. Thank you, audience, which is sort of why are casual fans the most tolerable by people outside the fandom and at the same time the most reviled by people inside the fandom, which, Court, I think you actually spoke to this, right? Is there's a lot of like what we might call hardcore fans who are like, Jen, you're not a real fan. But I think it's probably easier for my parents that I'm a casual fan, right? So can maybe talk about a little bit why that is? If anybody wants to jump on that.
Can I start off on this one? I think part of the reason goes back to, as Court says, you have literal fanatics, right? Who are almost like religious zealots when it comes to their, what we call like their fandom, right? The property to which they attach. And these are the ones who, like Court says, there's a lot of gatekeeping involved here. Like you have to do X, Y, Z, there are sometimes literal rites of passage in some of these groups now to be considered a true fan of a series or a true fan of a property. And it does become very much like a cult or a religion. If there's a distinction between the two, I don't know. I won't adjudicate on that one right now, right? But I think when you create that kind of, sort of subculture within your own culture, it does intentionally become very exclusionary. And so, when you have the idea that, like, these so-called hardcore true fans are, as Caleb asks, reviled by people both inside the fandom and also, least tolerable to those outside the fandom. It's because they really are putting themselves apart from others, right? Within the fandom, they're, we think of us with like the elitists, the most obsessed, right? You can't have a casual conversation with them. Literally, you can't, because they obsessively go to this property, this topic, this series. And so-called casual fans, we're just kind of like, oh yeah, I really like the lightsaber fight in this particular scene of, like episode 9. And then of course the true fan comes, it's like, how do you like episode 9? It's one of the sequels, they're all terrible because it's not true Star Wars. And like I said, folks, it all has the Star Wars logo on it. It's all Star Wars, you can obsess over the canon all you want, but sometimes canons change. It even happens in academia, it happens in philosophy too, folks. So if it happens here, it can happen in, pop culture as well.
Nice, thank you. So I actually think this is a question that I've wanted to ask for a really long time, and you brought it up. So in my defense, I'm not bringing it up out of the blue. What's the difference between a religion and a fandom? Does anybody want to take that on? Everybody's like, I will laugh at you, Jen, and then not answer.
No, I actually discussed this in my The Real Meaning of Doctor Who, because at several Doctor Who conventions, and typically Doctor Who and Star Trek kind of try to battle each other out of who can be, the greatest gatekeeper and obsessed fans. And so I've had people ask me, is Doctor Who a religion? And there for a while, there were several discussions across the internet about this. And so one of the things I discuss is that often in religions, you've got these different characteristics that seem to show up, and they mirror our pop culture universes, right? They provide an ethic, they provide rituals, they provide spaces to worship, community, all these things. But one of the things that seems to be missing is that religions typically posit the existence of the divine or the unseen, something beyond that transcends human experience. And that's one of those problems where no matter how great our fandom is, I don't know of any that have posited the existence of a divine being beyond the realm of the fandom, right? So that's where I think there's a strong argument to say that our pop culture things are maybe some sort of humanist religion, but they wouldn't count as a theological based religion. I could be wrong, and I mentioned that in the book. I'm like, I could be totally wrong, and if you want to call it a religion, that's fine. But that seems to be at least one major difference between a religion and, say, something in pop culture.
But although there are some, I think there is a group that has posited the Jedis as a religion, and in fact, I think that they have been recognized as a religious sect. So there's some people that have taken aspects of these pop culture elements and made them into forms of religious practice. So there are those folks that are practicing the worship of the Force, at least the light side.
There is a website you can go to and sign up to be a Jedi Master. I don't know if you've done that, Colin, but you can get your Jedi Master license.
I'm afraid I'd too quickly fall to the dark side. And this is the reason, by the way, you don't see more people identifying as Sith, because there can be only two. No one wants to throw themselves in that kettle right there.
Paula, I saw you about to jump in.
I was just going to bring up that in Star Trek and Star Wars and Doctor Who, you do have various religious imagery that is brought up. For example, right in the Doctor Who series, the new series, in what is it, the Last of the Time Lords, right? The Doctor is considered to be, everybody chants his name, right? And you have this ascendancy of the Doctor. So all of these different groups actually deal with religious imagery. It's whether or not that religious stature really gets transferred. I don't know if we want to necessarily say that our fanatic fandoms are, really a cult, but, some would not be unhappy with that, I think.
SpongeBob, all right. SpongeBob has a church, based on this kind of upbeat, positive thinking, having fun in life. So I do know SpongeBob has coalesced around those groups, but I don't know enough about SpongeBob and the movement to speak fully on it.
No, I think this is really helpful, right? Because I think it sort of starts to get us at what is unique about fandoms, right? In some sort of way. So based on that, I have sort of a question that I think takes us in a slightly different direction, which is I always take it that one of the defining features of fandoms is that they're fun, right? I don't know, presumably being a fan is fun. I enjoy being a fan. And so I was wondering if maybe some of you would like to speak about what is it that makes fandoms fun, right? Why do people get so into this and go for it, right?
I would say being a fan of the property can be fun. I'm not sure that fandoms are necessarily fun. So there's a saying that no one hates Star Wars like Star Wars fans. You've maybe seen this on the internet at some place, but the idea is that because the fans can be the most toxic on the planet when it comes to actually engaging with or talking about the properties in these ways, right? And again, like we said earlier, there can be certain issues of gatekeeping, almost like a cult-like mentality in some of these cases. But it can also be very much fun, right? To be part of a group with shared interests. We know this actually this can have positive, psychosocial effects for us as well. That being said, yeah, I think, part of just being a fan of something is being able to just be absorbed into that universe, right? Into that world, which even though it might be a complete fiction, is still in a sense accessible to you, right? So for me, when I think about what is that I enjoy about Star Wars, it's this, in some ways, very, very simple account, right, of battles of like good and evil, but also having these really interesting, complex, nuanced undertones to this as well, which give me a lot to explore, a lot to engage with, right? You jump into the Star Wars galaxy, it's like jumping into a giant sandbox of possibilities. And that's just something that's fun to play around. Like look at like conventions, right? And cosplayers. There's so many ways to engage. It's really, really, I think, appealing on multiple levels for people, intellectually, socially, just in terms of just general leisure, I think.
I would say one thing about, that I think is sort of a hallmark of the Star Trek universe is that, many people that I talk to and many people that I see are drawn to the kind of overall cosmology that Star Trek presents, which is the idea of a hopeful future for humanity, going out and exploring the stars, overcoming so many of the different kinds of forms of domination and oppression that we currently suffer in the world. And, there's also a kind of a really robust sort of setting of different forms of representation. So people, different marginalized communities can see themselves represented in the characters in this world, working together, solving problems. And I think that, one of the things, at least nowadays, is that so many people, and particularly young people, are just searching for some kind of sense of hope for the world, a sense that the future can be something to look forward to. Surveys just show that so many young people are just starved for this kind of a vision. And I think that one of the things that Star Trek has consistently always had is that sort of sense of a hopeful future where we can come together as humanity and do some really amazing things because we've overcome so many of the different kinds of problems that we currently face. And so I think that the Star Trek fandom is really drawn, I think, to the idea of like, what would it mean to live in that kind of a world and to aspire to live in that kind of a world? And hope is something I think always that comes out for the Star Trek fandom.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Paula, I'm sorry.
I was just going to chime in. You mentioned, hope for humanity, but I think it's in a sense broader than that, right? It's hope for all species or a lot of species in the universe, those who are different from ourselves. The Doctor, Whoniverse and Star Trek and Star Wars, you have aliens, non-human aliens, you have androids, all of which are beings worthy of respect and, and can be, your friends. Yes, there are villains too, but even in, as the Doctor approaches villains, they are worthy of respect. They are valuable. And that's why the Doctor, for example, gives the villains a choice before there's any further force or anything that has to be involved, because all beings are worthy of value and should be recognized and respected. And these fandoms give us that opportunity to see what it would be like in a positive sense.
Cool. No, thank you. Court, did you want to jump in there? You're all good? Cool. Okay. No, thank you for that. So we have another audience question. And this question is asking a little bit about the distinctions between genres. So the question says there's been sort of a revived talk about the distinctions between sort of science fiction, fantasy, superhero genres, right? And so I think the question is sort of like, how do we draw these lines, right? So you're all in different fandoms. Are you all in science fiction fandoms? Are they fantasy fandoms? Are they superhero fandoms? Or are they a blending of all three, right? And it doesn't really make sense to distinguish in these ways. How should we think about these genres?
I think something like Star Trek here is a good example of science fiction. So if you go back and you look at the history of science fiction, and there's some really nice Cambridge companions to science fiction and fantasy that help make this clear. But we see with science fiction a basis in science, right? You use science to create the problem, you use science to create the mystery, but then you use science to typically solve it. taking into account the crystals and, you know, the dilithium crystals and all that sort of, you know, coming up with the answer out of thin air sometimes, but all fandoms do that. That's not an attack for Star Trek. Doctor Who kind of goes back and forth where, you know, it starts off, it has this very deep science fiction aspect, but then there are times in the 70s when it became very gothic. And then at some point, there was the episode Kill the Moon, which many fans hated, some fans loved. But the creature that the moon was an egg, and the creature that came out of the egg was bigger than the moon. And so that's like, it's not possible to do that. And then all of a sudden the moon's back. And so that's where fans were like, well, now the show's become fantasy because it's not grounded in what is scientifically possible. And so to me, that's a helpful distinction between the two. But I think there are some really interesting ways to blend both genres and do some really intriguing stuff without using metachlorians, right? We don't need metachlorians.
Sorry. I was hoping someone was going to mention that, right? No, I think this is a case for like Star Wars as an example of, you know, trying to do this blending between fantasy and sci-fi, because if you actually watch the original trilogy, right, there's very little discussion of the science going on and anything they're doing, right? It's basically, you know, a sort of Western, it's like a samurai Western space soap opera is what you have across three movies. And in this way, I think that Star Wars is really, in a lot of ways, fantasy in space. It's not actually until later properties that you start seeing them go in and try to explain the way in which certain things work from a technological or quasi-technological perspective, right? So, for example, those of you who watched the Mandalorian series on Disney Plus, right, the whole thing about the way the Beskar works and how it has certain limitations, how it has to be like melted down to a certain temperature, what have you. It does sort of blend this idea that, you know, you have Beskar, which in a lot of ways is like mithril from, you know, Tolkien, almost this mythical material. But working it, talking about, you know, alloys and stuff like that, that does go more in, you know, direction of actual conventional metalworking, right? So we start seeing a sort of blending of genres in this way. I mean, to me, a lot of folks are like, well, you know, of course, Star Wars has to have like fantasy elements, right? You have the Force, you have the Jedi, you have the Sith. And I'm like, actually, the thing that's most unbelievable to me about Star Wars is TIE fighters. I have no idea how they stay in the air, in atmosphere. In space, sure, anything can fly. In atmosphere, it makes no sense to me. That's the most fantastical thing to me about Star Wars, right there, are TIE fighters, right? But it's true. A lot of these cases, I think, it's funny because Jen and I were just teaching this in class today, right? Distinguishing sci-fi and fantasy. It's often very hard to do. And I think that these kinds of cases, I mean, actually, a really good case for this, I think, is the recent Marvel film, The Eternals. So for those of you who haven't seen it, I don't want to spoil too much. But the main characters are superhero archetypes. They have fantastical powers, seemingly magical powers, but they're also in a lot of ways really just super, super advanced robots that have been created by like quantum amazing technologies, by powerful, like very, very long lasting civilizations, right? So is it a fantasy setting? Is it a superhero setting? Is it a sci-fi setting? Is it all of the above just sort of mashed together in this weird blend? I don't know. It's hard to pull these things apart, right? That's just my 2 cents. It's really difficult to take them apart, although it's fun to try. I think this is philosophy. We like analyzing things. This is cool for us.
You know, one thing I would think is I agree with what everyone has said, is that I think that, right, in terms of like the whole sort of bigger genre of speculative fiction, which includes things like science fiction, fantasy, and even there's other sorts of films like alternative histories, magical realism from Latin America. I think these are all sort of different kinds of imaginative genres that are related to one another. Science fiction, of course, I think is sort of, it takes, as Court was saying, right, science and extrapolates it, you know, its possibilities. For me, fantasy really has, as it was one of the audience members was saying, usually has some kind of fantastical, right, notion, which means like magic or some kind of supernatural, something that's out of the ordinary, or that defies the laws of nature as we understand them, defies science. And yes, you do find a lot of that kind of stuff in science fiction. in a lot of ways, right? We have Q in Star Trek, which who knows what he is exactly. But thinking about superheroes, I just wanted to make this comment. Superheroes are a really interesting genre, I think, and it's really changed, and over like the close to a century now that we've had of this kind of way of thinking about stories. For me, what I think is always interesting is to think about like the origin or the time period in which superheroes sort of come to be. And, for me, they're always tied with certain kinds of notions of nationalism, right? Sort of trying to think about heroes as sort of the embodiment of the best that you can be. Superman, of course, like one of the archetype of superheroes, right? For this kind of notion of always fighting for liberty and justice and America. Now, of course, change the motto, I think, is something for a better future, which I think is interesting. It's no longer truth, justice, in the American way. But and also the reactions of superheroes have always been to try to overcome very, very sort of grounded kind of social political realities like fascism, right? And so many of these heroes are trying to help us to think about how we can overcome some really, really concrete social political problems. And it's interesting to tie them to those historical moments. For now, I think the superhero genre is a really fascinating one to think about when it's related to the questions about like transhumanism. Like, Star Trek has Khan, the superhuman genetically enhanced individual. And what I talk about in my classes is like, we're on the verge of doing the kind of technological innovations that created Khan in Star Trek, with all of the big problems that that storyline creates. We now have the possibility of perhaps altering what it means to be human in some really, really interesting ways, perhaps to enhance us intellectually, physically. What does that mean? What will it mean to be human? So I think that superheroes are a really fascinating genre because they really sort of tie into our questions about what do we want to be able to defeat? What kinds of evils do we want to overcome? But then they're tied to these deeper sort of philosophical questions too, I think, about what does it mean to be human? So superheroes have a real sort of place in my heart in these kinds of ways. It opens up a lot of different ways of thinking about things in ways that are unique, I think, and related to all the different kinds of other speculative fiction genres.
Yeah, I'm reminded, right, of the very first comic book of Captain America, right? When you said that, right? So the very first imprint of Captain America is like punching Hitler, right? Famously before the United States had entered World War II, right? And that was a statement, right? That was a really important political statement, right? That the publishers made. You just made me think of that. So I think there's actually this leads right into an interesting question, which is, so in y'all's view, like, what are some of the deepest philosophical questions that are raised by your fandoms, right? Is it just that fandom gives us a way into philosophy, or is it that fandoms really themselves ask deep philosophical questions that we might not consider otherwise? Did I stump everyone? It's early to be stumped.
I'm just tired of going first, so. But I will go first. I'm not afraid. Yeah, so, I mean, one of the things like with Doctor Who that first really caught my attention was the notion of regeneration, right? That's something that as a kid, I had, no clue what that was. And it didn't make sense to me. I'm not sure it still makes sense to me how it all works, especially related to identity. But it was a fascinating concept. And, that's one of the neat things about popular culture, different fandoms, is the fact that they're basically case studies, right? And that's what I argue in the ultimate Star Trek and philosophy. I have a chapter in there on medical ethics in Star Trek and how it's like, the perfect series for these case studies, because it's very precise and methodical, unlike Doctor Who can go off and do crazy timey-wimey stuff. But yeah, so stuff like using that imagination to push the boundaries of what we think is possible gives us regeneration. gives us a TARDIS, which is bigger on the inside. You know, how is that possible? Two things existing at two different spots, but at the same time. And I mean, you know, people who know quantum physics say that at least that's, you know, there are those like particles that do that. There's ethics, right? There's the great thing where Tom Baker is going to destroy the two Daleks, or destroy all Daleks. And they're basically little baby Daleks. So I'm sure they're cute and cuddly, except they will kill you. But he's going to kill them. And he's just like, well, wait a second. He stops in the middle of the episode and has this ethical quandary, right? Do I have the right to destroy this species? They hadn't done anything yet. And so there's just all that. There are the big time paradoxes. I mean, there's just so much that it just challenges your mind to dig deeper, especially if you're a curious person. And I'm one of those people who a question gets raised and I don't want to stop until I figure out an answer. So.
Thank you. So, I mean, what you're saying is that baby Daleks are much like baby humans then. Cute and cuddly, but might be deadly.
Right.
That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, extremely.
Accurate. No, thank you. Does anybody else want to take a stab at this? Sort of, I mean, should we think of fandoms as, or of these properties as sort of just long thought experiments, or are they more than that, right? Do they encourage us to think in ways we otherwise maybe wouldn't?
Well, so I was going to comment on this. I think I agree with Cord in some sense that, you know, for at least for Star Trek, I'll speak just from Star Trek, is that the kind of episodic nature, right? So, you know, you have now 60 years of television with so many different series. I think someone's calculated there's about 800 different episodes from 6 different series that you could watch for Star Trek. So lots of different kinds of stories to be told. And Star Trek has often been called, you know, like episodes of morality plays of various types, that they have these, you know, different kinds of questions, philosophical questions can be asked through all these different kinds of episodes. But the thing for me that I think always that draws me to Star Trek is, as I mentioned before, is the kind of cosmology, and not so much a cosmology, but the sort of theory of history behind Star Trek, which is this this idea that, right, humanity overcomes all of its problems and then becomes this kind of fantastic. You can hear my dogs in the back here. You can hear this sort of like really fantastic space exploration species. But to get to that is this enormous, there's decades and decades of dystopia. There is World War III, there's eugenics wars, right? The next, in the Star Trek timeline, at least starting in the next 2 years and going on for the next like about 40 years, it's really awful. There's going to be millions of people that die. And it's at that point then that the sort of Star Trek utopia becomes possible. And it becomes possible because we as human beings learned how to work together to overcome our problems. And so I think that there's a really interesting kind of notion of humanism that comes out of Star Trek that I think is fairly unique, right? Which is that in order to get to the utopia, in order to get to that kind of world, we have to learn how to work together to do so. And I think that, you know, when you look at Gene Roddenberry's kinds of thoughts about what Star Trek was about, he thought that we had it within ourselves to be able to do this kind of work. And so, you know, he talks about all the different kinds of things that the things we've had to overcome historically to get to that. So that's what always strikes me really fascinatingly about Star Trek is like, what is it about us as human beings that allows us to be able to come together in that kind of way? And that's a sort of kind of I think a philosophical anthropology that I think that that Star Trek really offers. It's really interesting to sort of try to get into the depths of.
And so then if I can say a bit for Star Wars, because there's a lot you can do here, although really quickly I want to say, so I'm reading the comments section right here. For someone asks, the Doctor is trapped in samsara, true or false? In court, you say true. And I think the answer, I think you're right. I think he is in samsara, but he might be a bodhisattva or approaching one. So maybe it's okay in this case. I don't know. Sorry, I'm also a Buddhism nerd, just a little bit. But Star Wars, I mean, there's so much we can do philosophically in Star Wars. But one of the things that so just to preface a little bit, One of the things I do is I specialize in East Asian philosophies, primarily early Chinese thought, and some early Buddhist thought as well. And one of the things I do appreciate about Star Wars is that, you know, intentionally or not, George Lucas does introduce, I don't know if I like this expression, but I'm going to go with it. So like a pan-Asian influence in the universe he creates. And part of this includes some of these less commonly taught philosophies. You do see aspects of early Taoist thought, of early Buddhist thought appearing in, you know, characters like Obi-Wan and Yoda, right? As they try to counsel and instruct Luke as he begins to, you know, he continues his Jedi training over the time. In fact, the Jedi Code, in a lot of ways, sounds a lot like certain formulations of the Buddhist philosophical mission, which is one of compassion, where we, you know, provide enlightenment in the world. We end the cycle of suffering. So as it puts out in the comments, so it happens if you copy Hidden Fortress, right? Which it's not an exact copy, but yeah, no, this was Lucas's major influence, right? I don't think Lucas initially intended to create a philosophical goldmine with his works. That might be incidental. That might just be something that, you know, we started reading into it over time. But whatever Lucas's intention was with Star Wars, the writer's intentions, Irving Kershner's intentions, it's become something that you can start looking into, are these ideologies, these philosophies, these traditions. And even if they're represented imperfectly in the Star Wars universe, right, they do provide a mode of access for many people who otherwise would either never encounter them at all, or would just never open a philosophy book or take a philosophy class in their lives. So, you know, when you're studying, you know, The Way of the Jedi, or you're watching Yoda or Obi-Wan instructing Luke, what's really interesting is that it's not a simple, straightforward morality tale of good and evil, despite how it gets depicted sometimes. There's nuance to it, right? The entire, you know, arc about, you know, Anakin Skywalker's corruption into Vader, and then Vader's redemption at the end of Return of the Jedi. By the way, apologies if I'm spoiling this for anyone. These movies have been out for like several decades now. So if you haven't seen them, that's kind of on you. But the way we look at this, right, is really interesting in the ways in which we talk about things like, say, moral acquisition in humans, moral development. Is morality static in certain ways? Can it be contextual? Does it have to be absolutist? Can it be particularist? There are really interesting and difficult ethical and meta-ethical questions that do come up in these films. Again, they're not always well presented. Clunky dialogue, cheesy dialogue. It's a spaghetti western in space. Do that what you will, right? But it is there, and the fact that we get these different perspectives, I think, is both interesting and valuable to us as thinkers, as communities.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in quickly on the point of ethics and what we take to be right and wrong actions. Doctor Who is just completely filled, as is Star Trek, with ethical issues and conundrums. What do you do, you know, when you run across, you know, some particular villain, and I want to, Court might want to get to this about whether or not Cybermen are genuinely evil, but, you know, when humanity is being threatened, I mean, how do you handle that? Is genocide an appropriate response? I mean, we have looked at the Holocaust. I mean, you know, World War II and genocide. Should the Daleks, in fact, be exterminated? Because that, after all, they are indeed set out, you know, to just exterminate anything that's non-Dalek. Moral conundrums about how do you have certain duties in certain contexts, or is it better to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number of people? How do you treat others? There's an episode in Star Trek Next Generation, right? Ethics, that raises very good questions about treatment of people who are different than yourselves. So I think ethics, it gives us ethical conundrums that makes us at least take a look at a problematic situation and then wonder how maybe we might handle it if we were in the doctor's position or out there in space, right? And with Star Trek. So ethics, I think, is one of the main things, in addition to some good timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey questions about time travel.
Always. So I think I'm gonna follow up on that, because I think what was interesting is that all of you brought up sort of like, right, so I heard some commonalities, right, and one was that like it expands your brain, right, sort of like these cool fandoms are they're sort of like mental gymnastics, right, they get you to play around with your mind in the problem space in cool ways. And then you all said like they bring up these really cool, what I would call kind of metaphysical questions, right? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have an identity over time, right? What is the nature of our lives, right? And then you all said, and they bring up these really cool ethical questions, right, and these deep political questions. So I wanna pursue that hair for just a minute, because I do think one of the things that happens in fandoms a lot is we like to talk about our heroes, but I want to ask about our villains, right? Because I think one of the things you all say is like we have ethical conundrums, right? Really, I just want to hear Court tell me why Cybermen aren't evil, but I'm trying to ask it in a broader way, right? But I am interested, right? Is in your fandoms. See, Court just left, right? He was like, I'm not doing it, but I am. Oh, there he's bringing back a Cyberman. But I am interested in, is there any consistent villain in your fandoms, is I think the question I'm stumbling my way towards, right? Is there anything that your fandoms sort of says is unequivocally evil, right? Or is everything up for debate as good or evil, and it's sort of contextual and depends and is inconsistent?
I think that, one of the issues, because in the Doctor Who book, The Real Meaning of Doctor Who, and in the Doctor Who and Philosophy, I deal with evil. And so one of the problems you run into is the fact that episodic television and movies are written by different authors. And not all of them stick to the canon or the Bible in terms of the fandom. So, I mean, the Cybermen are considered to be, they're one of the main villains in Doctor Who. They started out, there's a theme here, they started out as philosophers. They were sick of these human qualities, pain and suffering. And so they slowly got rid of all of those weak human components, kind of like Khan in a different way, but and were left as these logical, basically walking robots. And so in that sense, and why Cybermen aren't evil in Doctor Who and philosophy, I argue that, well, that makes them no different than, say, a tornado or a snowstorm. They don't have that intention. They don't have they have rational thought, but they don't have anything guiding or overriding that rational thought. Of course, the problem is different writers sometimes work in these features that are inconsistent, but it's good for storytelling. Two others really quickly, the Daleks, as Paula mentioned, right? They're kind of your example of the Nazis. They go around exterminating anything that's different, but even they are programmed to hate, right? When they are genetically modified and created, they were philosophers in the original 63 episode. They were philosophers who mutated over time. That was kind of rewritten in the 70s with Genesis of the Daleks, where they were just genetically modified Khalids. And so you can make a case that they have some free will, but again, if they lack emotions like sympathy, compassion, empathy, well, then maybe they don't, right? They don't have that ability. And then finally, the master is, or Missy, right? The master and Missy, they're the same, right? They have a different kind of human evil where they use manipulation to get whatever they want, and they're willing to kill and destroy anything they want for really no good reason, just for the fun of it a lot of times. But even they've become more complex. And I know Paula had a really nice article in Doctor Who and Philosophy about how there's a great case to be made that even we should have sympathy for the master. So yeah, there's a lot of gray there. Go ahead, Paula.
Well, as you point out in your chapter about the Cybermen aren't evil. They do have intentions of trying to upgrade humans, because emotions and suffering, those are detrimental to being human. Well, or at least from their perspective. You know, if you accept a Nietzschean approach or something, it might be a bit different. You know, we need to suffer. But from the standpoint of the Cybermen, they're doing humanity a favor by upgrading them. And in my piece on sympathy for the master was really essentially abused by the Time Lords and had the drumming in his head for all of his years, and forcing him to look into the time vortex as a child. Of course, he wasn't the only one, but they set him up in a way that facilitated his approach toward the world and destruction, and the desire to create havoc and destruction just for fun.
I was going to say that this is a really interesting question, because it really depends on what we mean by evil, I suppose. This is an interesting question, I think, for Star Trek, because Gene Roddenberry did talk about this when he was thinking about Star Trek. He wanted to tell stories that didn't have villains in the typical kind of sense of an evil, like a really truly evil presence. Most of the kinds of antagonists that are presented in Star Trek are usually presented as doing something that we might think of as evil. And then it turns out that the reason they were doing that was for some other kind of reason. So I'm thinking about in the original series, Star Trek, the creature, the Horda, that is killing miners on this planet, and they don't know what it is. And it turns out to be this kind of like lasagna-looking creature, and Spock is able to mind meld with it and realize, oh, it's not doing this to just murder people; it's doing this to defend its young. And you see that sort of turnabout constantly in Star Trek, right? There's the series Arena, one of my favorite episodes, with the Gorn. They go out of this planet, and there's this great lizard creature that Kirk has to fight. And it turns out that the Gorn was thinking that the humans were coming to invade its territory, and so that's why it destroyed the outpost of the Federation. And Kirk at the end has to he shows mercy. He decides not to kill the Gorn because he thinks maybe we were wrong. And so this is a story that you see over and over and over again in Star Trek. And so it's very hard to find in Star Trek the idea of something that's really, really, truly evil. I've said before, I think that in Star Trek, the only time that I see something that's represented as evil is maybe in the Next Generation, the Skin of Evil, the character Armus, who kills Tasha Yar. And even then, they try to give him a backstory about why he is the way he is. So they try to, humanize him in a way. So he's not truly this kind of like force of evil. He's just frustrated and full of rage, and that's why he does what he does. But I've said before, I think that the greatest Star Trek villains are Starfleet admirals. Over and over and over again, you see these people often doing really, really bad things for short-sighted reasons, because they're scared, because they're fearful, because they're xenophobic. And the Starfleet admirals create all this kind of havoc all throughout all the different kinds of storylines. And so in some cases, right, humanity is its own worst villain for having short-sighted, self-interested reasoning. And I think that's consistent with what Roddenberry said, is that when we want to look for evil, we look at our own short-sightedness and our inability to be able to empathize and to think in a sort of bigger way about what's good for humanity. And I think that if you're going to think about evil in that sense, I think that's what Star Trek gets about, is that we sort of get in our own way and our own inabilities to think with a moral imagination.
Caleb asked if the real evil is the prime directive. I want to hear you answer that, because I have lots of thoughts on the prime directive too.
We could be here all night about talking about the prime directive in a lot of ways. But I mean, there's one thing that's nice about this, I think, that is sort of like, and it's been, there's been all these iterations, like what exactly does the prime directive mean? And like almost everyone breaks it in some point or another. So I think the real interesting question is it evil, but when is it important to not follow rules absolutely? And I think that, all the cases of breaking the prime directive in Star Trek are about the incommensurability of different moral goods. And that's a fascinating thing to sort of think about. And I think that, if we need to break moral rules in order to do something that is truly morally appropriate, I think almost all of them do that, except for Cisco. Captain Cisco from DS9 breaks the prime directive in various ways, often for not very good reasons, willing to commit genocide. But he's still one of my favorite captains. I would follow Cisco anywhere.
I think pen pals, that's one of my favorite sort of breaking, because it's data breaking the prime directive, where you've got that little kid that he's talking to, like on the ham radio or whatever, and her planet's going to be destroyed, and right, he shouldn't be able to violate this principle. And of course Picard's ready to like tear into him, but at the end, I mean, there's just that great moment when Picard's like, well, thanks for reminding me that there are times where we have to break that. And for me, that's one of the hardest things, like in an intro to ethics class, as we're discussing Kant, right? This idea that there are no good reasons to break these duties. And to me, that's the perfect example of when, you should break it.
So this is one of the things I think is nice about Star Wars, is that you obviously have, your villains up front, right? It's politicians. No, I'm kidding. Maybe, possibly, right? No, it's really interesting, because if you think about the way we depict our antagonists in Star Wars, right? You have the stormtroopers, who are almost entirely faceless up until we get to, the sequel trilogy. You have Vader, right, who gets redeemed in the end after being corrupted by Palpatine. And of course, you have Palpatine himself, right? The Emperor, Darth Sidious, whatever you want to call him. He who must not be named, right? The Voldemort prototype is how I think about him. And someone was pointing out, like really, at the end of the day, Sidious, Palpatine is the one who is really orchestrating all of the bad things that happen across these films, right? And it's amazing that he's able to do it, because a lot of it is he's able to get people to believe in his cause. He's able to create this illusion. In some ways, he's almost like an anti-Buddha figure, right? Rather than actually giving salvation, he provides stability and order. This is how he takes over the Republic, right? It's like everything's falling apart, so now we're organized into the first galactic empire that will reign forever and ever, and will be. Everyone's like, yeah, this is great. You get Natalie Portman's great line, "This is how democracy dies," to thunderous applause, right? Which nowadays might feel a little bit too close to home for some of us. And then as someone points out, it's like, for someone who's a master manipulator, Dark Lord of the Sith, all these things, it's amazing how he manages to electrocute himself in every trilogy he appears in. He always electrocutes himself. Which, okay, I mean, he's not the most graceful, obviously, right? But to me, it's interesting because it's not just Palpatine, really. It's what Palpatine represents and what he does. And I'm not even referring to the dark side of the Force here, actually. It's the ability for humans, I think, to easily be cowed into certain dogmatic belief sets, be unwilling to shift from those positions, and then commit themselves to certain causes in which they're willing to overlook atrocities, overlook horrible, atrocious, horrendous behavior, all for the sake of what they take to be a common good. In this case, a sense of order, right? A sense of stability in the galaxy. So, damn it, if we have to oppress entire populations, we'll do it just for the sake of being able to maintain order. There's actually a really good mini monologue about this in one of the later Mandalorian episodes, where you encounter an Imperial officer who says, look, what everyone thinks they want is freedom, but what they really want is order. And the idea is this is why the empire is able to take hold. This is why, you know, the emperor is able to rule for so long, unchallenged by many, because you were in a state of huge civil war throughout the entire galaxy, right? Well, look, I can provide you stability. Just make me leader, grant me supreme power, and just follow my commands unerringly. And people are like, okay, yeah, you got us this far, sure, we trust you. Terrible, terrible idea, right? But we see this kind of issue play out again and again over human history. So even though this is taking place in a galaxy, you know, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, it does hit close to home. It is a cautionary tale that we should already know in a lot of ways. But hey, it's in space, so that makes it cool and interesting.
I mean, I think it is cool and interesting. I do. But I think like a lot of what you're pointing out, right, is, and on all of you, right, is the way in which these fandoms really complexify evil, right? And point out that it's no longer enough to just point at something and be like, ooh, evil, right? Because you've all said, right, all of your fandoms have stories where they try to contextualize it, right, and give it a backstory, right, or say like this is more complicated, right? We can have sympathy for the master, right? Or we can sort of make sense of this in certain ways, right? Right, or maybe the evil is things that initially just seem like parts of humanity, but it's when we start to do it in groups that it all goes downhill. Is that, so let me ask you this, which is I think maybe slightly more philosophical. Is it important that we try to get at the complicated nature of evil in this way? Is that an important thing to think about? Or would it be easier if we could just be like, nope, that's evil. I can just say that's evil and walk away. Or is this an important thing to think about, right? About the ways in which evil might not be so evil, or might be more understandable, or might be more tricky than, you know, just the devil or what have you.
Yeah, I think it's good to do complex analysis of characters. I mean, that's the hallmark of great screenplays, everything, right? Plays, movies, whatever. My only fear is that, you know, at some point there's the risk that we lose the confidence. I'm not sure if confidence is the right word, but we lose the confidence or willingness to call out evil, or if we don't believe in evil, wrongdoing, right? And so there have been times, semesters, when something really bad happened. I'm thinking like the Jerry Sandusky trials, or Jerry Sandusky that happened in like 2010 or 11. And I can remember going into my ethics class. He was the coach who was abusing children in horrible, terrible ways, and people just kind of overlooked it. And I just remember students and people on the radio, you know, saying, well, I don't know, right? I don't want to pass judgment on the guy. And it's like, no, the guy did unspeakable, terrible things to 12-year-olds. We need the ability to say that person is wrong. But usually in life, wrongdoing is much more complicated than that, right? It's cutting somebody off, or as you're driving, or it's being selfish. I think about Buddhism, right, where I listened to a Buddhist priest, and he was talking about how you can spend your whole life doing great work and let anger destroy that in mere seconds. And so I think that's where it's good that we see how complex evil is. I think it's good that those characters challenge us to look at how we are evil or self-interested or selfish, and how that can be wrong or evil. But my fear is that sometimes it leads to this kind of cynicism that there is no wrongdoing and there is no evil. And as an ethicist, I do want to say there are times where things are wrong and evil.
I'd like to jump in to tie in part to what Court says. When you think about the wrongdoings that are going on, if they're creating problems where people need help, then we've got an issue here of a lack of justice, right? And as Martin Luther King Jr. points out, there can be no positive peace without justice. And so when people are in need, right, and this is something Court writes on in his The Real Meaning of Doctor Who book too, right? When people are in need, there isn't justice. And so you have to be able and be willing to fight those who are committing the injustices and fight those unjust conditions in order to bring about justice for those people, to provide the needs, satisfy the needs, basic needs, not being abused by Sandusky, for example. And sometimes we need to coerce people to do that in various ways. And then the question becomes, well, what sort of coercion do we really want? Something that's, violent or nonviolent means, and how to approach it is a different matter. But yeah, I think we do have to recognize the genuine evils, but those who are committing those evils are creating a system, a kind of small system of injustice. And it's that injustice that needs to be rectified.
Yeah, I wanted to tie in here too, because I was just thinking about this kind of question about, had we given the idea of evil too short a shrift? I'm going to step out of my Star Trek role and say the other fandom that I'm really into is The Expanse, both the book series and the TV series. And what I like about that is some very sort of realistic and harsh confrontations with evil. There are some evil people in there: Jean-Pierre Mao, Marco Inaros, Winston Duarte. These are people who are greedy, they are selfish, they are cruel, and they are fascist in a lot of ways. And so dealing with them and seeing them fall and be dealt with is important. And that's part of what The Expanse tries to do. But I think that something that Paula just said is really important to understand too, is that evil sometimes is about structures, about systems in place, and not about agents and people necessarily. It's the idea of structural violence. And what's interesting about The Expanse is that I think it does really well to sort of highlight that sort of picture, right? So for those of you who don't know The Expanse, right, takes place in the same sort of Star Trek period, but it's a very much darker sort of picture of humanity. Human beings have gone out to colonize the solar system. So we're on Earth, we're on Mars, and then we're in the belt, the meteor belt just beyond Mars. But what's interesting is that Earth has become this kind of welfare state where we're overpopulated with 30 billion people, and there's universal basic income, but not very much else in terms of opportunity. So people go out into space. Mars is this kind of terraforming military dictatorship dedicated to the idea of turning Mars into an Earth. But then there's the belt, which is this working class oppressed region that looks like colonial parts of the world, right? What we used to call the third world or the developing world. It's where humanity works to provide the natural resources for both Earth and Mars, the inners, to be able to do their work. And these are people who are living in suffering and misery, all to provide well-being for people back on Earth and Mars. It's a system built on corporate exploitation. It's one that's built on the fascism of Earth and Mars being willing to dispense with the lives of the belters. And so it's a system in place that is evil. And there are figures that represent different aspects of it at one point or another, but there's no sort of mastermind of that exploitative system. And The Expanse really talks about how often we do that to ourselves as human beings, is we set up a system that we think is going to be in place for some good reason or another, and then it just starts to inadvertently create all these forms of oppression. And oppression is rife in the Expanse universe. And so trying to figure out how to analyze it, to deal with it, and to rectify it means more often sometimes than killing one person or one villain. And trying to figure out how to deal with those kinds of systemic questions of evil is often very complicated too. And I think Star Trek isn't necessarily very good about thinking about structural violence in that kind of way. But that's why I think that The Expanse is a really exciting sort of series for folks who are interested in that kind of notion of evil to get into.
So it's interesting you mentioned structural, institutional forms of violence, because this is something that I think has actually always been part of the Star Wars universe, but we're really seeing only played up now in sort of the newer properties, right? So the old Clone Wars cartoon, or currently The Mandalorian, and in Book of Boba Fett as well, with the way in which we engage with the Tusken Raiders of Tatooine. This is basically a sort of stand-in for like First Nations, Indigenous persons. And look at the way they're treated, right? In the original trilogy, you know, they are seen as villains, as scavengers. Obi-Wan just scares them off. In comparison, you have people like Din Djarin and Boba Fett who, you know, engage pro-socially with them. They engage in bartering. One character actually engages meaningfully to, like, you know, work with them, learn from them. It's a very interesting commentary on how you have some characters who are engaging positively with different groups, different cultures. And then you also have the Empire again, which represents this kind of ultimate oppressive force, right? Like look back to the original trilogy, look back at the core officers, look back at the troopers, like, they're all human, right? And they officers all have British accents for reasons that are utterly beyond me, but hey, it's space, we'll suspend disbelief right now, right? It's a very, very xenophobic structure, and in turn also becomes a very, very oppressive structure in these ways. This is one of the things I do think you see, is that there are multiple forms evil takes or wrongdoing takes in this universe. And the main pitch isn't so much that we say, like, is this actually evil? It's like, well, no, how do you understand it to be evil? How do you understand it to be wrongdoing? Whether it's intentional or not, there's sort of a subtle nudge towards sort of philosophical thought, even in the very first Star Wars film, where Obi-Wan talks about how the Jedi mind trick only works on the weak-minded, right? Your stormtroopers are representative of those who just go along with the agenda. They never question it. They don't challenge it. They don't critically reflect on it, right? The Jedi stand in as these analysts, these critical thinkers, those who are really delving into these issues and then responding accordingly. What's interesting is that we're not necessarily saying that there's one right way to resolve these issues, right? But there might be a plurality of approaches that still recognize wrongdoing as wrongdoing and might have equal relevant stake in terms of claiming this is a way of handling wrongdoing or evil in the world. It's almost a pitch for a kind of moral pluralism, which is interesting in that regard.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is, I don't know, I kind of think this is fun, right? We don't often get to talk about our villains, right? But our villains are kind of interesting. So we have a question from the audience here, which I think actually ties in with this conversation that we've been having, right? Which is that part of what these fandoms can do for us is explore themes, right? And they can explore themes in a way that is very different, right? And that lets us get into these nuances, right? That sometimes we don't want to do in the real world, right? So I'm sensitive to, like, in the real world, like, no, we have to do something, right? And so maybe you don't quite have time to go 6 episodes into the backstory, right? We're like, we can't do that right now. Like, we have to stop this, whatever is going on. And so I think one of the cool things is this exploration, right? But one of our audience members asks is whether or not the fantastical elements, right, whether we understand these to be strictly fantasy or sci-fi, or we sort of say, look, it's all speculative fiction, however you want to understand it. Do those fantastical aspects make the deeper themes easier to ignore or negligible, right? So a lot of you have talked about the humanism in your fandoms, and yet there are fans, forgive me, I will say this as gently as I can, seem to not be humanist, perhaps, right? And so I think the question is the fact that it's a fandom, does it make it easier to ignore these deeper themes? Or do you think by contrast, the fantastical elements make it easier for viewers to engage with these really tricky, right, deep concepts? So it's sort of like, is the fantastical element important, or is it sort of a byproduct, maybe?
I might be an outsider here, so I'm going to go first. I think a lot of times the fantastical element, the over-the-top element, detracts from the true storyline, right? That was one of the things that a attracted me to the classic series of Doctor Who, even with its shaky sets and people with obviously spray painted bubble wrap on their hands and stuff. It's just, it's just, really low budget stuff. But then that allowed the characters to become real characters and to bring these ideas to life. And so, and then that fostered the imagination to fill in the gaps that, yes, okay, here's a guy with bubble wrap on his hand. Now here's a guy in a sleeping bag of bubble wrap and it's all like spray painted green, but to me, it's real. So, but then if you look at the new series of Doctor Who, especially under Stephen Moffat, and his direction tended to be, let me throw in a bunch of comical, over the top antics that, people will sit there and say, oh, look, the Doctor's hanging from the TARDIS, or, he's not wearing clothes, or this and that. And it's just like, well, that to me has nothing to do with the story, right? It's just, it's for somebody else. And that's one of the things I love about Star Trek, is that Star Trek for so long was boring, right? I mean, it's good to be boring, right? I don't need over the top stuff. Let me just have some really good discussions about the human condition and those sorts of things. But I realize that I'm kind of an outsider that people enjoy. I saw somebody mention the Avatar, right? I hated that movie. I thought it was terrible. CG was fantastic, right? I mean, what they did with the mouths and everything, I could care less, right? I would rather watch the people in costumes, have a real genuine story. But to me, the story just wasn't there.
So if I can jump in here, because there's one of the comments in chat, Court, responding to your remark, that comedy can be a very good tool for exploring social injustice. There we go. Though it certainly suffers from the problem of appearing negligible or not worth critical thought. And I actually want to expand on this. I think this is actually part of the reason we do use comedy in some of these difficult scenarios, because it makes it more digestible for us. Because sometimes we start going down a really dark path that for a lot of folks can just, take you to a place you don't want to go. Adding the comedy in provides some much needed levity that's almost therapeutic, that lets you keep going with this topic, with this process, with this project, in ways that if you don't find, sort of absurd humor in it, you just become woefully in despair, just either turn off the program, stop reading, or you stop engaging, because I just don't want to do this anymore, is the reaction some people have, right? Which is why I think you do see comedy used, at least aesthetically, in certain ways, to provide the audience with access to this media. That being said, I actually agree, right, that the fantastical settings can in some ways detract from the messages or topics being conveyed. At the same time, I think they can be used to even more effectively convey the ideas as well. One, because you're presenting the absurdism of it in some cases by going to extremes. But also see, it's like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. But I can see at least a light parallel here between this real world situation. You can find the badness in it, or you can find the metaphysical plausibility or implausibility in it in these ways, right? So what's interesting is, I think that, you ask, like, does it add to it or does it detract from it? I think the answer is yes. It does both, or it can do both. Part of it depends on how well it's being done, and part of it depends on the audience, right? So I mean, I'm gonna nerd out about theater for just a moment here. Shakespeare famously, by dramaturgs, is regarded highly for this ability to write for multiple audiences somehow at the same time and just make it work. The play has something for everyone on every level. It just becomes accessible, and so people of different stripes, of different class, of different background are able to enjoy it in these ways. He's still writing for a British audience, but we'll put that aside for right now. And that's why I think actually some of the properties we're talking about, Star Trek, Doctor Who, Star Wars, I've got mention of Futurama here as well. A lot of folks like Futurama, are as effective as they are because they do tell stories that become accessible to a variety of people from a variety of backgrounds in a variety of ways that do let them engage with these issues, even if it's in a fantastical setting, in a manner that doesn't have the stakes so high and so immediate, so pertinent to where they are right now, that they can speculate about it and then come back to where we are, in real life, so to speak, and then apply what we're seeing in that medium, in that property, in that performance. So yeah, no, it can go both ways, right? It can be done very, very well. It can be done poorly. When it's a bunch of just like fantastical stuff and just like slapstick comedy being thrown around, yeah, of course the message is going to get lost. But there are ways of artfully inserting these messages more effectively into these comedic scenarios, and I do think that does facilitate for a lot of people who might be otherwise just woefully depressed by the state of things, either in the television show or in the world, for that matter.
I wanted to say about that, though. I think that what's interesting is that in the past, say, 5 or so years, there's been a real interest in kinds of speculative fiction that is realistic. I'm thinking of things like, I had a student a few years ago tell me, I really hate Star Trek because I think it's so corny. That yes, it talks about, you know, some interesting ideas, and there's some interesting sort of analogies made that are important to talk about social justice. But I said, all right, well, so what are you interested in? And she said, I really like stories like the novels of Octavia Butler, and I like Black Mirror, and I like A Handmaid's Tale. And what I think is interesting about something like Black Mirror is that it tries to show, like, what could the world be with, like, if we took something that's real right now and just extended the possibilities a little bit more, and what are the dystopias possible that are inherent in the moment right now. And the same thing I think is true about A Handmaid's Tale, right? Is that people were really interested in sort of seeing like how a real full-blown dystopia could arise out of a few moments here and there that were happening right around 2015, 2016. So I think people are interested in this kind of stuff also that's more quote unquote realistic, in the sense that, because they want to see like what is possible that we might want to avoid. So I like dystopian stories a lot too, because I think those are also indicative of things that we want to hold on to and are fearful of losing. And I think, you know, it's been shown in the past 5 to 6 years, there's been an upsurge in that kind of genre of storytelling. And that's frequently much more sort of realistic and less fantastical. It's fantastical in the sense that it creates a world that is so utterly devastating to look at that it might be fantastical, but it's usually based on something that is very, very real and in front of us. And so I think that there's a place for that kind of storytelling as well.
Cool. No, thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. So we're almost at time. I hate to say it. I feel like I have so many more questions to ask, but we've been going for a while, and I want to respect everybody's Friday night. So I think I'd like to wrap up by asking each of you, if you wouldn't mind, if you could sort of say one thing, right, about your fandom or about fandoms in general, right? Or like, what's the one takeaway message, right? If you could give our audience sort of one thing to bear in mind, either about fandoms in general or about your fandom in particular, basically why they should come join your fandom, right? Or why they should continue to think philosophically about their fandom. What message would you want to send out?
I mean, I would say find what you love and just immerse yourself, right? I mean, Jason just mentioned Farscape, right? That's one of the, I always wanted to do a Farscape in philosophy book, but I never could get the publishers to, to even respond to that. But yeah, find what there's something in pop culture, right, that's going to grab you and that you're going to find meaningful. And as someone mentioned earlier, right, there's such a lack of meaning in our, 21st century life that, if you spend your time engaged in that meaningful pursuit, whether it's on an intellectual level, so you want to study and write something, or you just get involved in the conventions, or maybe you just want to do creative stuff and sell stuff on Etsy, right? Whatever it is, right? Find that and let that fill your life with meaning, and then find a way to use that to fill other people's lives with meaning. I think that's, to me, the most powerful thing of all fandoms, is that constant sort of cycle, right? Of we're learning, we're growing, we're giving back, And these popular cultures, these fandoms do so much of that, no matter what it is, right? No matter what your favorite thing is, there's somebody out there that wants to talk to you about it. And with Zoom, right, you could do it all the time.
Anybody want to jump in next?
Well, I'll try to jump in here. There's so much I'd like to say. I mean, I think what these fandoms offer us is a way to, it's a kind of thought experiment. It takes us into another setting, but yet mirrors enough of our experience with our own world to make us think and reflect about how we treat other people, the issues of oppression or injustice, and look for ways in which we can enhance social justice and, you know, I'll echo the monologue of the 12th Doctor, right? You know, never be cruel, be kind. And I think that's one of the messages that, you know, Doctor Who, even though the Doctor and companions have to engage in lethal force sometimes, one thing that's really important, and in this way, it reminds me, you know, Gandhi and King, that no one is ever entirely beyond redemption. I mean, in a sense, or at least maybe it can give us the sense to try to look at people that way and be kind, rather than being hateful and oppressive to other people and different viewpoints. Be open and willing to think about new things and see things from different perspectives and treat other people and perhaps potentially other beings as valuable and worthy of moral respect.
Join the dark side. We have cookies. No, no. One of the things I think that you can appreciate about Star Wars, about many fandoms, is that there's often a kind of optimism in them. There is a kind of hope for the possibility of a better world, a better tomorrow, a better community, a better life. And this is something that we see frequently as a trope here, right? Moving toward progress, moving toward a better, more harmonious universe, better galaxy. But one of the other things I want to, you know, emphasize here is that it's also about finding tranquility in the moment, in the here and now. There's sort of an irony to Star Wars when you look at the fandom, how tumultuous it is. While many of the core messages of the series are about finding serenity, right? I mean, again, we go back to the much maligned prequels as well. Obi-Wan talked about being mindful of the future, which is one half of it, but not at the expense of the present moment as well. Star Wars, in a lot of ways, in many of these fandoms, fandoms in general, I think, can be toxic, but they can also be remarkably therapeutic. And in this way, I think there actually weirdly ends up being something philosophical about it as well. Philosophy primarily aims in a lot of ways at trying to reconcile certain ideas, beliefs, understandings of the world at the ethical level, metaphysical level, epistemological level. And in a lot of ways, that's what we're aiming to do, be it through, you know, the Jedi, you know, way of mastering the Force, or if you're like a certain former bounty hunter, just a simple man trying to make his way in the galaxy, like his father before him. It's all about sort of finding your place and finding your fit in a lot of ways, while not giving up on the criticality of thought. So it's kind of an open responsiveness, but not without critical analysis, is part of the ideal.
And I would just sort of say, I think it was Bukowski, right, that said something like, find something you love and let it kill you. something like that, right? This is an amazing time, I think, to be a fan in almost all of the different fandoms that we've been talking about. There's like this renaissance, this explosion of these stories. Star Trek now has about 5 different series on the on television right now. You know, all this discussion about like what's going on with Star Wars. So the thing to hope for, I think, is this: let's hope that Paramount and Disney doesn't kill these fandoms with superficial corporatized storytelling. And there's no better time than ever, I think, now to be a fan. I mean, it's been a lot of this stuff has been really accentuated by the fact that, you know, we have streaming television and we could do deep dives and watch shows over and over and over again and become dedicated sort of hermeneutes about the small details of episode 5 or you know, what's going on in DS9 and does it mix with what was going on in Enterprise, right? We can be those kinds of people. And I think that it's important that, you know, we make space for that, make space for the people that can comment and think and reflect and learn. And what I enjoy most, I think, about these fandoms is being able to bring my kids up and to show them and to share the joy with them and take them to these things. And I think that with conventions, with all of this kind of stuff, there's so much richness there to be able to expand storytelling and expand imagination. And I've seen it happen with my students when I expose them to this stuff. I've seen it with my kids, and it's exciting. And so I think that as most, you know, I want to emphasize again, I think the best that we can do is to hold on to the richness of the stories that these different fandoms have been telling for so long about all of us, about humanity and what we're capable of. And I think that that's some of the richness that we really need to preserve and to keep on going. And so it's an exciting time to be a nerd.
Yes, it's so true. Oh my gosh. So on that wonderful note, please help. I know it's all virtual, but thank you. Help me thank our panelists for just a wonderful sort of evening of fun. I thought it was a wonderful conversation. So thank you all so much for giving up your Friday evenings to talk about your fandoms and the nature of evil and the nature of identity and what's worthwhile and what humans are like and all of these awesome questions. So yeah, thank you all so much. We really appreciate having you. To our audience, thank you again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this Philosophy in the City. If you liked it, there's another one next month, so you can join again. Be on the lookout for announcements about that. And if you have anything you'd like us to cover in Philosophy in the City, you can let me know. You can shoot me an email or a carrier pigeon or whatever. So thank you all so much. We really enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again another day. So thank you so much.